Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. Uh, the chapter is titled International Committee of the Fourth International of the 1960s. And here we go. A substantial part of the Anti-Pablo International Committee of the Fourth International, which had functioned during most of the 1950s, refused to go along with the, quote, reunification, end quote, of the Fourth International, which resulted in the establishment of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International in 1963. This dissident element of the ICC centered on the British Socialist Labour League, SLL, of Jerry Healy and the French Organisation Communiste Internationaliste, OCI, of Pierre Lambert. For something less than a decade, these two organizations and a few other national groups of less consequence maintained their own version of the International Committee. The Third Conference of the International Committee, those groups remaining in the International Committee held a conference shortly after the establishment of the United Secretariat and proclaimed their unwillingness to participate in the USEC. They held their third and last conference in London in April 1966. It was reported that, quote, delegates and observers from 10 countries attended. Delegates from 2 African countries were prevented from attending by passport difficulties, end quote. This 1966 conference adopted 3 basic documents: a resolution on, quote, rebuilding the Fourth International, quote, report of the Commission on Rebuilding the Fourth International and the tasks of the International Committee, and a, quote, manifesto. It also defined which national groups would be welcome in the International Committee and which ones would not. Subsequently, polemics were to develop within the IC over whether the task before it was to, quote, rebuild, end quote, the Fourth International or to, quote, continue it. Apparently, the resolution of the 1966 conference on the subject was something of a compromise. At least the SLL leaders were later to argue that, quote, while it is formally true that the final resolutions in some places retained the terms, quote, reconstructing, end quote, rebuilding, end quote, what is certain is that the content of these resolutions was above all the continuity of the independent parties and of the Fourth International fought for and preserved by the International Committee, end quote. The basic political resolution of the conference recounted the history of the, quote, degeneration, end quote, of the Comintern, the, quote, betrayal, end quote, of post-World War II revolutionary possibilities by the Soviet leadership and the Social Democrats, and the struggle within the Fourth International from 1952 on. It concentrated particular attention on the alleged, quote, revisionism and liquidationism, end quote, of the, quote, Pabloites, end quote, and the United States Socialist Workers' Party. The organizational report, also adopted by the 1966 conference, proclaimed that, quote, the London Conference reaffirms that the program and method for the building of the revolutionary parties and the Fourth International are to be found in the transitional program. This program remains the only one that is capable of providing a solution to the problems raised by the historical crisis of revolutionary leadership, end quote. It also asserted, quote, the conference affirms that the Fourth International has not degenerated. The continuity of the Fourth International has been fought for and maintained by the International Committee's actions, end quote. This report also called for the holding within 18 months of the, quote, Fourth International Conference, whose aim will be to rally all Trotskyist organizations fighting for the program of the Fourth International. This will include a struggle by the International Committee to rally to the ranks of the Fourth International the militants and groups who are misled by the revisionist leaders of the United Secretariat." End quote. The Fourth Conference did not take place. The most important organizational decision of the Third Conference was to exclude from the membership the Spartacus group from the United States and the Voix ouvrière group from France, which had been represented by the quote, observers, end quote. The quote, American Commission, end quote, of the conference delivered a report which was unanimously adopted by the official delegates to the meeting. It recognized the American Committee for the Fourth International, which, like the Spartacist group, had originated from a split in the Socialist Workers' Party in the early 1960s, as the United States affiliate of the International Committee gave it instructions to organize as such. Of course, the IC already had a French section, the OCI, which more or less automatically meant the exclusion of the Voix ouvrière. The quote, manifesto of the International Committee of the Fourth International, end quote, adopted by the conference had three sections, quote, 1. The crisis opened by the war continued. 2. The bureaucracies against the revolution in Vietnam. 3. Build the revolutionary leadership, end quote. This last portion set forth the basic orientation at that time of the International Committee in subdivisions under the following headings, quote, the Fourth International fights unconditionally for the victory of the Vietnamese workers and peasants, for the defeat of U.S. imperialism, end quote. Quote, the Fourth International fights for the unconditional defense of the conquest of the Chinese Revolution, end quote. Quote, the Fourth International fights for the independence of the trade unions from the state, end quote. Quote, the Fourth International fights for the united front of the working class. Quote, the Fourth International fights for the United Socialist States of Europe, end quote. Quote, the Fourth International fights against slander and repression, end quote. End quote, for the rebuilding of the Fourth International, end quote. Interestingly enough, there was no emphasis on or discussion of the importance of the philosophy of dialectical materialism in any of the documents adopted at the Third Conference of the International Committee, thus a question which was to be one of the pretenses for the split in the organization half a dozen years later seems not even to have been a subject of discussion at the 1966 meeting. Although the Healy-Lambert version of the International Committee did not hold any other full-blown international conference after that of 1966, it did have several somewhat more restricted sessions at which all or most of its national sections were represented. There was a meeting of the International Committee in June 1967, which was attended at least by representatives of the British, French, and Hungarian sections, and its discussions centered principally on the most recent Arab-Israeli war. In September 1967, another meeting of the International Committee had an agenda dealing with the situation in Ceylon. Work of the youth section, a, quote, international discussion, end quote, an assessment of problems of the sections in Greece and the United States, and celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Although other detailed information has not been encountered concerning similar International Committee meetings subsequent to 1967, it is clear that preparations were begun for another full-blown conference of the IC and its affiliates. To this end, in July 1970, a pre-conference of the International Committee sections and groups associated with it was held, a step towards an international conference regrouping organizations, groups, and militants who based themselves on the transitional program, end quote. This was the last, more or less general meeting of the Healy-Lambert International Committee as a single tendency of international Trotskyism. Even during the existence of the Healy-Lambert tendency, There was some debate about how many national affiliates it had. The OCI maintained in November 1971 that there were 8 regular sections in the International Committee: the Socialist Labour League of Great Britain, the OCI of France, the League of Social Revolutionaries of Hungary, the Partido Obrero Revolucionario, POR, led by Guillermo Lora in Bolivia, the Revolutionary Communist Party of Ceylon, the Liga Obrera Marxista of Mexico, LOM, the League for a Workers' Vanguard of Ireland, and the Workers' League of the United States. It maintained that the two groups emerging from a split in 1967 in the original Greek affiliate of the International Committee had been accepted as, quote, sympathizing groups, end quote, rather than regular sections of the International Committee. On the other hand, the Socialist Labor League at about the same time denied the POR had ever been accepted as a full member of the International Committee and insisted that the majority Greek group after the 1967 split had continued as a full-fledged section of the International Committee. Efforts were made to extend the scope of the Healy-Lambert IC during the years it existed. There was a group of Hungarian exiles who formed a Hungarian section. It took the lead in 1969 in organizing, quote, a conference of members from Eastern European countries, which led to the formation of the Organizing Committee of Communist Trotskyist Militants of Eastern Europe, end quote. There is no indication given as to how many such East European members there were or from which countries they came. Attempts were also made to expand the organization into Latin America. In 1969, the faction of the Bolivian POR led by Guillermo Lora became associated in one way or another with the International Committee, and in the following year, the Mexican LOM was recognized as a regular section of the International Committee. Then in February 1971, quote, on the initiative of the OCI, acting on behalf of the International Committee, a meeting was held in Europe for Latin American organizations and militants, with the aim of preparing the conditions for rebuilding the Fourth International in Latin America, end quote. Aside from the Bolivian POR and the Mexican LOM, there was present at the meeting representation of the Argentine group known as Política Obrera, quote, which has proclaimed its loyalty to the transitional program from its foundation, but has until recently developed on the fringes of the internationally organized Trotskyist movement. End quote. The Brazilian Trotskyist Bolshevik faction, a breakaway from the Posadas group in that country, had been prevented from sending a delegate by the military dictatorship. Finally, delegates were reported as attending from Peru, Brazil, and Venezuela, quote, in an independent capacity, end quote. A long resolution was adopted which put forward the slogan of a, quote, United Socialist States of Latin America, end quote. It was maintained at the meeting that the two countries of the region which had at that moment the most fertile ground for the advent of a socialist revolution were Bolivia and Argentina. Understandably, the International Committee concentrated a good deal of its attention on the rival United Secretariat of the Fourth International. Aside from frequent denunciations of USEC in periodicals and of official resolutions, there was at least some exchange of polemical pamphlets between the two groups, particularly in the earlier years. Jerry Healy published early in 1967 a pamphlet, Problems of the Fourth International, which centered most of its attack on the United Secretariat and particularly on the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. The USEC replied in kind. In the same year, Ernest Mandel, put out the pamphlet Marxism vs. Ultra-Leftism, Key Issues in Healy's Challenge to the Fourth International. In spite of these polemics, an effort was launched by the IC in 1970 to recommence, quote, discussions, end quote, with USEC. Jerry Healy met on 2 occasions with members of the USEC concerning, quote, the possibility of joint discussions centered on outstanding political differences and directed toward the holding of a joint international conference, end quote. USEC turned down these overtures. Split in the Healy-Lambert International Committee. Let me swig this coffee right quick. Who's fucking texting me? Man, I'm just macking over here. You don't even know. Split in the Healy-Lambert International Committee. From its inception, the Healy-Lambert International Committee had a kind of bipolar characteristic. The two strongest groups in the organization, the Socialist Labour League of Great Britain and the Organisation Communiste Internationaliste of France, both led by strong-willed characters, tended to group the other national sections of the organization around them in a more or less satellite fashion. The tension between the two factions reached a breaking point in 1971-72. It is clear that there were differences of opinion and interpretation of the position of the International Committee between the leaders of the Socialist Labour League and the OCI, at least as early as the Third Conference in 1966. However, these differences were compromised at that time. In May and June 1967, there was an exchange of long letters between the OCI and the Socialist Labour League, in which they criticized one another in a more or less gentlemanly fashion. The OCI complained about the inability of the Socialist Labour League to keep a functioning international apparatus going for the International Committee. The major element of dispute between the two groups at that time was the concept of the OCI of the necessity to, quote, rebuild, end quote, the Fourth International. In contrast with the Socialist Labour League's contention that the Fourth International continued to exist in the International Committee, the major organization requirement of which was that it build new sections in various countries. However, in spite of these early disagreements, it was not until 1971 that matters came to a head between the Socialist Labour League and the OCI, leading to a split in the International Committee. By that time, Healy and the other leaders of the Socialist Labour League had come to place extraordinary importance on the role of the philosophy of dialectical materialism, and on the need to propagate it and to apply it to current situations. For its part, although not discarding dialectical materialism, the OCI leadership emphasized the importance of the specific revolutionary program to the success of the socialist revolution, and most particularly the importance of the transitional program enunciated by Trotsky in 1938 to this end. This issue was ostensibly one of the causes of the 1970-72 split. The other was differing opinions concerning the role of the Bolivian POR in recent and current events in that country. The situation began to reach crisis proportions in July 1971 in Essen, Germany, at a youth rally officially sponsored jointly by the Alliance de Jeunesse pour le Socialisme and the Young Socialists, the youth groups of the OCI and the Socialist Labour League, respectively, but principally organized by the French group. The OCI reported that some 5,000 young people from 32 countries attended the meeting, including many who did not consider themselves Trotskyists, such disparate groups being represented as the Youth Organization of the Spanish Party of Marxist Unification and the National Students Association of the United States. The AJS, on behalf of the International Committee, that had drawn up a draft resolution for adoption by this youth assembly. It elaborated at some length on the rise of revolutionary possibilities in the industrial capitalist countries as well as the developing ones, and on the supposedly growing pressure for political revolution in the, quote, worker states, end quote, and urged the special role to be played by the young people in this allegedly revolutionary wave. The The British Young Socialists introduced an amendment to the AJS motion and said in part, quote, the continuity of the struggle for revolutionary Marxist theory in the past, the struggle of the Fourth International and the International Committee was the only basis for the initiatives which led to this rally and for the struggle to build the international revolutionary youth movement. Revolutionary youth everywhere must devote themselves above all to the task of developing Marxist theory through the struggle against bourgeois ideology in all the forms it takes in the workers' movement, end quote. The amendment offered by the Young Socialists was opposed by the AJS and was not voted upon at Essen, but was referred to the Liaison Committee elected at the Essen rally. When the Liaison Committee finally met in November 1971, the Young Socialists did not attend, so once again no definitive vote was taken on their amendment, and the Liaison Committee urged the Young Socialists to take their place on it at its next meeting in January 1972. Meanwhile, a controversy had begun over the role which the POR had played during the 10-month regime of General J.J. Torres, which ended with Torres's overthrow in a short civil war in August 1971. The POR of Guillermo Lula had played an important role in the, quote, Popular Assembly, end quote, formed by unions, peasant organizations, and left-wing political parties during the Torres government, meeting in the building of the National Congress, which had been dissolved. Lula and his OCI supporters maintained that the Popular Assembly was a, quote, dual power, end quote, roughly equivalent to the Russian Soviets in 1917, and that Lula and its other leaders had been carrying out the kind of united front which the Trotskyists had always advocated. They had prepared the way for the socialist revolution, only to be cut short by military insurrection and the unwillingness of General Torres to arm the workers and peasants. The Socialist Labor League leaders strongly attacked Lula and the POR for having, quote, supported, end quote, the Torres government and for not launching the slogan for his overthrow, arguing that the POR's attitude had been a, quote, betrayal, end quote, of Trotskyist principles. The documents involved in this controversy include an editorial published by Thomas Woolforth of the U.S. Workers' League on August 31st, 1971, which was republished in the Socialist Labor League periodical, attacking the behavior of Lula and the POR, a statement of the Central Committee of the OCI on September 19th, 1971, defending the position of the POR, and a statement dated October 12, 1971, signed by Lula of the POR, Pierre Lambert for the OCI, Balázs Nagy of the League of Socialist Revolutionaries of Hungary, supporting the POR's position, but saying that the party's behavior should be carefully studied by the International Committee, and condemning the, quote, method used by the Workers' League and the SLL, end quote. Following this exchange, a document was issued on October 24, 1971 by the, quote, majority, end quote, of the International Committee, reportedly including representatives of the Socialist Labor League, the Workers' League, the Revolutionary Communist League of Ceylon, the Workers' International League of Greece, the League for a Workers' Vanguard of Ireland. That document denounced actions of the OCI going back as far as 1967, returned to repudiation of the POR and its behavior before and during the Torres regime, and took exception to the OCI's organizing a meeting in Paris at which Stéphane Just of the OCI was described as, quote, Secretary of the International Committee for the Reconstruction of the Fourth International, end quote. The document claimed that, quote, this is a split from the International Committee and its politics. It is a split by a minority, end quote. On November 24, 1971, the Central Committee of the OCI replied to this, quote, majority, end quote, document. It denied that those who had signed the October 24th statement constituted a majority of the IC, and charged that by organizing a meeting of the five groups which had signed the statement, the Socialist Labor League and its allies had in fact been the ones who provoked a split in the International Committee of the Fourth International. At considerable length, it again defended the OCI and the POR and denounced the recent behavior of the Socialist Labor League. In any case, regardless of who had been responsible for the final acts which constituted a split in the International Committee, that split was a fact by the end of 1971.